He was a famous trumpet man from out Chicago way. He had a boogie style that no one else could play. He was the top man at his craft. But then his number came up and he was gone with the draft. He's in the army now, a blowing reveille. He's the boogie woogie bugle boy.
Women and men's fashion was relatively simple compared to now. Women wore plain dresses that cut off at the ankles. Their colors were solid and plain, such as gray, black, and white. The accessories worn were not very intricate. They included handkerchiefs and purses. They also included hats, which changed from the beginning to the end of the decade. In the beginning of the decade, the entirety of the head down to the ears were covered. Big ribbons and bows and a large rim were also evident. In the later portion of the decade, smaller, thinner ribbons were used. The hat covered less of the head, and the rim was smaller. Belts were worn above the waist, and they were very thin. Shoes were typically plain. They were simple, and they typically could have been black high heels. Men's suits were very simple. They were black or gray, worn with a white dress shirt, a solid colored tie, and a wide-rimmed, plain-colored hat. Colors perhaps included black, brown, or gray. Shoes were usually black or brown, shined, and they were very dressy. Children's outfits were simple and functional because they were used for work. Since they typically got filthy, outfits were plain and easy to replace. For girls, long sleeve shirts were worn under their dresses. Work boots and shoes were used. Also through the 30s, the KKK ran rampant. The highly recognized outfits were all white and consisted of a pointy hat, a symbol on the chest, and narrow eye holes.
Baseball was very popular in the 1930s. During this time, they made the National Hall of Fame, choosing Ty Cobb, Honus Wagner, Walter Johnson, Christy Mathewson, and Babe Ruth. During this time, people went to the ballpark to forget their troubles they were going through because of the Great Depression. They started night games because of falling attendance at the baseball games. The Negro League started to become a big hit to the public. They started making the All-Star baseball games. For football, the NFL draft was introduced too. Despite the economic hard times, automobile development was on the rise. There were three main manufacturers: Ford, Chrysler, and GM. Cars in the 1930s were becoming more luxurious than the cars in the 1920s because they developed more significant new features during this time. They released the more affordable automobile when they created a V16 engine for the Cadillac. This redefined personal power. Many people couldn't afford to buy these automobiles, but the business still boomed.
Art in the 1930s was another instrument used by people for entertainment. Painting, in particular, had made a large mark on the decade. Influential visual artists of the 1930s would include John Stuart Curry and Thomas Hart Benton. Curry painted in a realistic fashion, namely realism, while Benton relied more on abstract objects and shapes to create his work.
Literature is written works, especially those considered of superior or lasting artistic merit. Examples include novels, short stories, magazines, poems, and more. During the 1930s, there was a high growth of culture and mass media. This was due to the fact that the majority of people turned to it to forget their troubles caused by the Great Depression. Books that are considered aces from this time period include Of Mice and Men and The Grapes of Wrath, both by John Steinbeck. Also, Gone with the Wind by Margaret Mitchell, The Hobbit by J.R.R. Tolkien, The Big Sleep by Raymond Chandler, and The Yearling by Marjorie Rawlings were snazzy books of the time. All of these were written in the late 1930s and later made into movies. Most literature of the time had a harsher, bleak mood to it, which was the effect of fascism, which was practiced by Adolf Hitler and Mussolini of Italy. It was a what I say goes type of government. This international control led to writers using it in books. Life magazine, which was published from 1883 to 1972, was bought by the Time founder Henry Luce in 1936, where magazine shifted to mostly photojournalism.
Music was very popular in the 1930s. Woody Guthrie was a folk singer, and he introduced This Land Is Your Land. Also, Broadway was very popular in the 1930s. Alfred Drake was a very popular star, as well as Joel Grey. Alfred Drake was in Oklahoma, and Joel Grey was in Georgia, and many more. On Your Toes was also a very popular Broadway show then, and one of the most famous songs from there is It's Got to Be Love. Also in the 1930s, movie musicals were very popular. For example, The Wizard of Oz, starring Judy Garland as Dorothy. It was the first movie in color. The Andrews Sisters was also a very popular singer. They sang Boogie Woogie Beagle Boy. Billie Holiday was also a very popular pop singer, and she sang Strange Fruit, and there was also a current musical named after her starring Audra McDonald. Roy Rogers was also a very popular pop singer. He introduced Home on the Range. Shirley Temple was also a very acknowledgeable child star. She sang a very popular song, Animal Crackers in My Soup. Swing dancers were very popular as well because they danced to jazz music. Jazz music consisted of drums, piano, string bass, saxophone, clarinet, trumpets, and trombones. Getting into movies, Marilyn Monroe was a very popular movie star. She was in the movie How to Marry a Millionaire. Also Judy Garland, as said before, she was in The Wizard of Oz. Also a very popular movie then was Gone with the Wind, which is a very dramatic movie, but long. Also Charlie Chaplin was a silent movie star.
He was a famous trumpet man from out Chicago way. He had a boogie style that no one else could play. He was a top